Zak Ebrahim was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on March 24, 1983, the son of an Egyptian industrial engineer and an American school teacher. For Ebrahim, a childhood amid terrorism was all he knew. Though his radicalized father modeled fanatical beliefs, the hateful ideas never resonated with the shy, awkward boy. The older he grew, the more fully Ebrahim grasped the horrific depths of his father's acts. The more he understood, the more he resolved to dedicate his life to promoting peace. He now speaks out against terrorism and spreads his message of peace and nonviolence. In 2013, he participated in TED's Talent Search in New York City and was selected to speak at the main conference, TED 2014, in Vancouver, BC. His TED Talk was released on September 9th, 2014, in conjunction with the publication of his TED book, The Terrorist's Son, A Story of Choice, and has been viewed more than 2 million times. Crisscrossing the eastern United States from Pittsburgh to Memphis, from a mosque in Jersey City to the Busch Gardens theme park in Tampa, Ebrahim's story is one of a boy inoculated in dogma and hate, a boy presumed to follow in his father's footsteps, and the man who chose a different path. Please welcome Zak to Wingate University.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. My name is Zak Ebrahim, and I'm here today to share some stories from my life in the hopes of illustrating that no matter what path you're put on, you can choose to promote peace. Now, before I begin, I feel the need to explain that my story is in no way a description of the vast majority of Muslim family life, both here in America and abroad. In fact, when people take the time to interact with one another, it doesn't take long to realize that for the most part, we all want the same things out of life. A job with a decent wage, a safe environment to educate our children, and to live in a community that doesn't chastise us for our beliefs. However, in every religion, in every population, you'll find a small group of people who hold so fervently to their beliefs that they feel they must use any means necessary to make others live as they do. Being raised in the home of a Muslim zealot, I've been exposed to many of the things that people fear about Islam, yet I stand here promoting peace. This would be impossible in a world where we hang on to our old prejudices. I'm here to dispel the stereotypes that some politicians and media pundits attempt to project into mainstream society. I feel that I can use my experiences to combat those who would take advantage of people's fears for their own ends, because of political opportunists who use the more radical elements of Islam to generalize the beliefs of all Muslims, but also because of extremist groups themselves who believe that the lives of innocent people are fair game on the ideological battlefield. I'm compelled to speak up in an attempt to balance the scales. Now, it's a foolish mistake to believe that religious extremism is exclusive to Islam. Unfortunately, there are endless examples in every belief system of religiously motivated violence. But as a society that values the individual freedoms afforded to us, it is un-American to ostracize entire communities for the actions of a few. When we ostracize the innocent, it tears apart the fabric of our society, which only works to foment the next generation of intolerance. It may come as a surprise to some that although I was raised in the religion of Islam, I'm no longer a Muslim. And that has little to do with my feelings on Islam in particular, and in fact, I only bring it up to point out that I'm not here advocating for any particular belief. I'm simply here to share my stories and the lessons that I learned from them. Now, having said that, I would like to illustrate the path that I was put on as a child by my father, who, for most of my life, has resided in maximum security prisons. This was a special Friday for me. I was a normal 6-year-old staring at the chalkboard waiting for the 3 o'clock bell to ring so that I could escape from school. But that day my father was waiting in the hallway early. He said, "Salamu alaikum," which means peace be upon you. And I replied, wa alaikum salam, and peace be upon you, the proper way for two Muslims to greet one another. He tells me that we're going to the mosque for Friday prayer, where the blind Sheikh Omar Abdurrahman was to preach. You see, at midday every Friday, millions of Muslims around the world gather in mosques to listen to sermons given by sheikhs. The Quran, the sacred text of Islam, says that praying in a group brings you more blessings than praying alone, making Friday prayer the most blessed prayer of the week. Now, most clerics preach harmony between Muslims and non-Muslims, believing that there is a place in this world for all of its inhabitants to live in coexistence. The blind sheikh was not one of those men. He sat at the front of the worshipers with a microphone attached to his collar. And I sat there trying my best to mimic my father as he listened intently to the sheikh's words. That day, the sheikh argued that Western culture was corrupting Muslims all over the planet, that the consequences of American democracy were materialism, sexual perversion, and idolatry, meant to distract believers from the true word of God, laying the blame for the Muslim world's ills on many of the same groups that Jerry Falwell blamed for 9/11, pagans, feminists, and gays. But the sheikh saved his most venomous words for that of the nation of Israel. He spoke of interference and collusion by the United States and its Western allies to further their agenda at the expense of Muslim nations. And he used that support to foment the emotions of his congregation. He also claimed that the United States had persevered in its Cold War with the Soviet Union by using the hearts and bodies of Muslims as a military and economic strain, and that once the Soviets fell, America discarded those Afghan fighters like trash on the side of the road. When the blind sheikh finished his sermon, my father took my hand and led me toward the front. This wasn't the first time I had met the sheikh. In fact, I had spent more than a few nights either at the mosque or at one of my father's friends' houses, or even in our own living room, sitting on the floor, listening to the men discuss religion and politics. I realized it was always somewhat ominous exchanging words with the sheikh after one of his sermons. And it's looking back now that I realize even in a room full of people vying for his attention, his mind was somewhere else, probably still wrapped with the passion and anger he clearly conveyed in his speech. On the drive home that afternoon, I wondered to myself what made the sheikh and his followers so intensely devout. I asked my father, "When did you become such a good Muslim?" And he responded, "When I came to America and saw everything that was wrong with it." And in that instant, I saw the same look on his face that I had seen earlier on the sheikh's. Our family dynamic began to change soon after. It was during that time, at the height of the Afghan war, that I was forced to say goodbye to one of my best friends. His stepfather took he and his siblings from their home in New Jersey to Pakistan to train and then eventually fight in Afghanistan. He was 10 years old at the time. Because of his inexperience, he was used to lob grenades at the enemy's occupying forces. And when he'd returned to America less than a year later, where once there stood a happy, vibrant child, now stood a solemn veteran of the Afghan war. He was a shadow of his former self. His innocence taken from him by a war he had no business being a part of. This is what happens when we use violence as a resolution of conflict. In a back and forth effort to gain even the slightest strategic advantage against one's enemies, man has gone to lengths that seem inconceivable to those who are sheltered from the negative effects of war. But make no mistake, humanity has shown that it's willing to exploit almost any resource, even the lives of children, all in the name of one ideology or another. Each time we resort to war, whether as a means of resolving conflict or for spreading some ill-conceived notion of freedom, we guarantee an escalation and desensitization of violence in our culture. The summer after I turned 7, my grandfather came to visit our family from Egypt. Little did he know my father had brought him to America to try and convince him to take my family back to Egypt so that my father could go fight in the Afghan war. You see, at the time, the United States had been secretly funding the Mujahideen, the Muslim men and sometimes children, who were going to Afghanistan from all over the world to fight. My grandfather's response was, absolutely not. Your family is your responsibility. If you want to make jihad, stay here and take care of them. Now let's take that word jihad, for example. If you were to ask the average person, what do you think jihad means? They may say that it's an act of terrorism, or that it means holy war. But that is not the definition of jihad. In reality, jihad can be something as simple as providing for your family. It's only the extremists and those who wish to generalize that reduce the word to a destructive act. And in fact, in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad specifically refers to jihad that precludes violence as the greater jihad. Now, my grandfather went back home thinking that he had won the argument, but my father was left only frustrated and unwilling to find a non-violent outlet for those frustrations. On November 5th, 1990, when I was 7 years old, my father assassinated a man. That man was Rabbi Meir Kahane, the leader of the Jewish Defense League. The JDL, as it was called, was described by the federal government as the largest terrorist organization operating inside the United States at the time. And in fact, many people saw this as the work of one extremist killing another. And while attempting to flee the scene, my father was also shot by a federal postal officer, and he and Meir Kahane were rushed to the hospital with similar gunshot wounds. Kahane died at Bellevue Hospital that night. My father lived. Although initially acquitted of the murder while serving time on assault and weapons charges, my father began planning attacks on a dozen New York City landmarks, including tunnels, synagogues, and United Nations headquarters. Thankfully, those plans were foiled by an FBI informant. Sadly, the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center was not. My father, Al-Sayed Nasser, would eventually be convicted for his involvement in the plot. A few months prior to his arrest, he sat me down and explained that for the past few weekends, he and some friends had been going to a shooting range for target practice. And he told me I'd be going with him the next morning, and to be honest, I was so excited I could barely sleep that night. And my excitement once again began to mount the next morning. We arrived at Calverton Shooting Range on Long Island, which unbeknownst to our group was being watched by the FBI. My father and I walked towards a group of men huddled by the trunk of a car, and inside were a range of weapons. When it was my turn to shoot, my father helped me hold a rifle to my shoulder and explained how to aim at a target about 30 yards off. I was so nervous, my palms were sweating. I gently squeezed the trigger and my ears rang and the noise echoed through the woods that surrounded the range, and a small knot showed where the bullet had broken through the canvas. Hearing the praise from the men around me and with my father looking over my shoulder smiling, it was one of my proudest moments. He seemed to be having almost as much fun as I was, if not more. Using a fully automatic weapon, he shot the legs out from under one of the larger targets, causing it to come crashing to the ground, and the men all shouted and had a laugh. But by late morning, it began to softly drizzle, and I knew our time at the range was coming to an end. So on my last turn, I took aim at the target and let each bullet fly. The last one I shot hit the small orange light that sat on top of the target, and to everyone's surprise, especially mine, the light exploded. And as I stood there, not being sure if I was in trouble or not, my uncle turned to the other men and in Arabic said, Ibn Abu, like father, like son. And they all seemed to get a really big laugh out of that comment, but it wasn't until a few years later that I fully understood what they thought was so funny. They thought they saw in me the same destruction my father was capable of. Those men would eventually be convicted of placing a van filled with 1,500 pounds of explosives into the sub-level parking lot of the World Trade Center's North Tower, causing an explosion that killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 others. these were the men that I looked up to. These were the men that I called ammu, which means uncle. It saddens me to think that had they not committed this crime, the innocent people killed in the attack would be at home spending time with their loved ones. Instead, their families are forced to live their lives without their guidance and companionship. I was 7 years old when my father went to prison. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't wish he had chosen a peaceful path. Instead, he exposed me from a very young age to the intolerance and radical nature of extremism. And yet I stand before you all today with this simple message, that no matter the level of violence you've been exposed to, it doesn't have to define your character. That in all of us is the ability to change our paths. I spent many years of my young life visiting him in different prisons. Rikers Island in New York, the federal prison in Manhattan, and even entire family weekends inside Attica State Penitentiary. I remember my first trip to Rikers Island like it was yesterday. It was a dull gray morning. My family and I had gotten into our old wood-paneled station wagon and headed into the city. Now, when we arrived to the Rikers Island parking lot, there was this light mist that seemed to cut us off from the rest of the world. And I hadn't seen my father in several weeks because he'd been recuperating from his wounds. But it was pretty obvious, even to a 7-year-old, that this was going to be a strange day. A bus took us across a bridge to the main facility where we were taken into a building, my family and I, and frisked for any prohibited items, and then we were walked down a long hallway lined with cells that provided privacy for the families visiting inmates. As one of the guards opened a door to a cell, I saw my father sitting on a plastic chair in an orange jumpsuit. And he stood up and he smiled, and he took his time giving me a hug. And then we sat down across from each other at the table. The first thing I noticed was the long surgical scar that ran across his chest and up his neck where the doctors had tried to remove the bullet that was lodged inside him. I remember the whole time trying not to stare at it. And while he and my mother sat in conversation and he declared his innocence to her, I sat wondering how his being in prison would affect our family life. That first trip was nerve-wracking, but as the weeks turned into months, it became routine to have to pass through armed guards and barbed fences in order to see my father. We spent weekends in Attica in a tiny house surrounded by barbed wire fence where my mother would go shopping and buy tons of groceries, and we would spend this weekend in this home, and she would cook, and we could rent movies and pretend to be a family, and this was the closest that we ever came to actually being anything like a normal family after my father went to prison. And this went on for years, but eventually my mother remarried, and we decided as a family to discontinue any further contact with my father. We also changed our names so as to hide our identity from the community in which we lived. It's certainly unusual when an American citizen admits to being the son of the first member of a bin Laden organization to shed blood on American soil. Shame for what my father had done, and fear for how I would be judged for his actions had caused me to hide my identity from most of those who knew me. I realized at a young age I had to be careful who I told my life story to. People's reactions have ranged from nervous laughter and shock to outright anger and threats against my life. I even once sustained a defensive wound across my hand as I tried grabbing a knife from someone I thought was a friend as he lunged at me exclaiming, "I'd be doing this country a service if I killed you." Thankfully, I was able to escape without any serious injury. By the time I turned 19, I had already moved 20 times in my life. And that instability during my childhood didn't really provide an opportunity to make many friends. Each time I'd meet one or two people I began to feel comfortable around, it was time to pack up and move to the next town. And being the perpetual new kid at school, I was frequently the target of bullies. Now, the truth is, I could stand here for hours and talk to you about the experiences that I've had being bullied, but for brevity's sake, I'll just give you a short little glimpse. It was the 7th grade, and my family had just moved back to Pittsburgh, so this was another year of me being the new kid in school. And whether it was because I had a funny sounding name or I was the chubby, quiet kid or the new kid, I seemed to be getting a lot more attention at this particular school by the bullies than I had in the past. And the way the hall of the 7th grade was set up was basically like an H, but with 2 lines through it. And just outside of the hall was the bathroom where a lot of the bullying took place. And you know, when you're being bullied on a daily basis, you kind of learn these tricks about how to try and avoid being harassed or beaten up. And let's just say that if the worst thing that happened to you when you went into the bathroom was that someone beat you up, it was probably the best case scenario. But often what I would do is I would run out of the bathroom as fast as I could, and the first hallway that crossed the main one had the dean's office in it, and he had a habit of standing outside of his door. So just before I reached this hallway, running at full speed, I would throw myself to the ground, and hopefully the bully who was chasing me would fly right past me, and the dean would be outside, and he would get written up or to detention or something. And if I was unlucky, the dean wouldn't be there, and I'd probably get beaten up. But these are the sorts of things that you try to deal with to cope with these kinds of situations. And I remember coming home every day with bruises or scrapes from getting into a fight, and telling my mother about these experiences, and I could see how it was wearing on her, until one day I decided that I was just going to stop talking to her about it. Not because it didn't affect me in a terrible way, but because I refused to allow my tormentors to affect my mother in a negative way. And while the bullying didn't stop, it felt in a sense like I was taking control somewhat of these experiences, and frankly, I felt like I was giving myself some strength. As the year progressed, the bullying unfortunately got worse, and it was to the point that I was, my school had a policy of suspending anyone involved in a fight. So even if I just gotten beaten up, I was getting suspended for days on end or even a week, which was perfectly fine for me because that meant I didn't have to be in school, but it didn't make for much of an education. And my mother had been to the school a million times, and they couldn't seem to find a solution for it. Until one day, my guidance counselor told me that they were transferring me to a school for kids who had trouble being bullied, and that there were more counselors there than students. And for the first time, and I can't even remember how long, I was actually excited about going to school. And on my first day, I get to this school, and the first thing I notice is actually that there are a couple of the kids who had bullied me really badly at my old school there, and I thought, well, this is strange. And it turned out that this was actually a school for kids who couldn't be kept around all the normal students. So I had essentially been made to have to spend time with the kids that had tormented me. And my first day, waiting for my mother to pick me up at the end of the day, a counselor was standing outside, and he looks at me and he says, "So what are you in for?" Like I was in prison or something. And I told him that I get beat up a lot. And he looked at me like I was lying to him and like I was crazy. And this was just another instance of being made to feel like this was somehow my fault. And as the years went on, I kept to myself. I tried to spend as much time at home reading books and watching TV or playing video games. And for those reasons, my social skills were lacking, to say the least. And growing up in a bigoted household, I wasn't prepared for the real world. I'd been raised to judge people based on arbitrary measurements like a person's race or religion. So what opened my eyes? One of the first experiences that challenged my way of thinking was during the 2000 presidential elections. Through a college prep program, I was able to take part in the National Youth Convention in Philadelphia. Now, young people from all over the country had come to Philadelphia to talk about issues that affect them, and my particular group's focus was on youth violence, and having been the victim of bullying for much of my life, this was a subject in which I felt particularly passionate. My particular group's focus being on youth violence, I had the opportunity to interact with young people that frankly I hadn't had a chance to before in my life. And a few days into the conference, I found out that one of the kids that I had actually become particularly close with was Jewish. Now, I had never had a Jewish friend before. And to be honest, I felt a great sense of pride in myself because I felt like I had accomplished something that had never been done before, which is of course ridiculous, but this was the first time in my life that I had thought to myself, perhaps what I had been taught wasn't true. Not long after that, I moved to Florida, and I got a summer job at Busch Gardens, an amusement park. And there I was exposed to people from all sorts of faiths and cultures, and it proved to be fundamental to the development of my character. For much of my life, I'd been taught that being gay was a sin, and by extension, that all gay people were evil. And as chance would have it, I had the opportunity to interact with some of the gay performers at a show there. And I soon found that some were the kindest, least judgmental people I had ever met. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but being bullied as a kid created a great sense of empathy in me toward the suffering of others. And it comes very unnaturally to me to treat people who are kind in any other way than how I would want to be treated. I don't know what it's like to be gay, but I'm well acquainted with being judged for things that are beyond my control. I had a conversation with my mother about how my worldview was starting to change. And she said something to me that I will hold dear to my heart for as long as I live. She looked at me with the weary eyes of someone who'd experienced enough dogmatism to last a lifetime and said, "I'm tired of hating people." And it sounds so simple, but it was so profound for me that I often fight back tears just thinking about it. It wasn't just that you could see the toll that the fallout of my father's actions had on her. The years of dealing with death threats and the FBI and lawyers, being ostracized everywhere she went. But it was like my mother was giving me permission to go out into the world and experience people unencumbered by the prejudices I'd been taught. And it served to me as a reminder that we must work together in order to achieve our goals. Remember that extremism thrives on the fringes of society. When we divide people into smaller and smaller groups based on one arbitrary distinction or another, we create communities ingrained with hostility toward one another. People can become frustrated when they think one side cannot or will not understand their point of view. This is why I promote interfaith dialogue, because I feel that it's one of the most useful tools for encouraging solidarity within our communities. And when I say dialogue, I don't mean that we pile everyone into a room to debate who's right and who's wrong about a particular subject. All I'm talking about is simple interaction, sharing a meal together, or working together on a community project. It not only aids in dispelling false stereotypes and prejudices, it helps to create stronger, safer communities. Opening up dialogue between different faiths helps to promote mutual respect and understanding. And I really encourage everyone here to look into the different ways to foster interfaith dialogue in your schools and your community. For a time, I chose not to come out with my story because I was ashamed for what my father had done. But today, most times you hear about Islam or the Middle East in the news, it's usually related to some form of extremist behavior. And I knew that I could use my story to combat those negative stereotypes. If I could show people that although I had been subjected to this violent, intolerant ideology, that I did not become fanaticized. That if I can choose to promote peace, then anyone can. However I speak, the subject inevitably turns to groups like ISIS and what we can do in our society to combat those willing to go to such brutal lengths for their beliefs. And to that, my answer is a relatively simple one. Don't give in to fear. Do not allow the actions of a radical group to alter our society in a way that further alienates non-violent citizens marginalized by a fearful majority. Groups like ISIS traffic in anger, fear, and vengeance. Religion is used simply to cloak the intentions of men like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, but it is those human emotions, the anger, the isolation, that bind the rank and file. And this is how we can make a difference. This is why we must choose peace. Always remember, it's not the proliferation of an idea that gives it its value, but the implications of that belief. Now, part of being in the public eye is that if someone wants to get in contact with me, I'm never more than a few clicks away. And one morning I woke up to find an email from the Bureau of Prisons saying that an inmate would like to begin communication with me. And I first thought, who could this be? And sure enough, it was my father. And it also said that I had 10 days to decide yes or no to the communication. And the truth is, before I ever started speaking publicly, I had wanted to get back in contact with my father. I wanted to understand why he chose the path he did. Did he do it for his faith or for fame? Did he feel the need to be a part of something greater than himself? If so, why wasn't his family enough? Now, honestly, I wasn't really even sure if I was ready to hear the answers to these questions, but every part of me felt like I had to know. I thought to myself, what if he died in prison and I never got this chance again? So I clicked yes. Now, our communication began nicely enough. He told me that he supported the work that I was doing, and that in recent years he too had been advocating for a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I told him about my life after he went to prison, about being poor and moving from ghetto to ghetto and the bullying. It was important for me that he understand how difficult things were for my family after he left, and particularly for my mother. And as the communication progressed, I told him that I was no longer a Muslim, and the tone of his emails began to change. And when I tried to continue our conversation, he basically told me that all of the negative experiences I had were God's will, and that his actions were God's will, and that if I just returned to Islam, that all of my problems would be solved, which, as an atheist, is not something that I wanted to hear. And eventually, it frankly became very unhealthy for me to be in conversation with him, and I decided once again to end communication. And for months after that, I was extremely disheartened. You know, I very naively entered our conversation thinking that I would ask him these grand questions that I had thought about for much of my life, and he would answer them openly and honestly, and I would have some kind of revelation like you see in the movies. But the real world is rarely so simple. But as time went on, I realized that he did in fact give me the answers that I was looking for. His ideology led to a narrow and oversimplified worldview, one in which a person's race, religion, gender, sexuality was all that was needed to determine that person's worth. I realized then that I had put way too much importance on my questions and particularly on his answers. And the lesson that I learned from that experience was that I no longer needed his answers, and in a sense, it set me free. Sharing my story over the last 6 or 7 years, I've had the amazing privilege to have some really incredible experiences. And one of them was when I was asked to speak in front of a group of young people between the ages of 12 and 24 who were part of an organization called Tuesday's Children. Now, Tuesday's Children began as an organization for the families of victims of September 11th and eventually grew into one that provided support for the families and victims of terrorist attacks all over the world. And I'd never been so nervous to have to give a speech. Here I am standing in front of these young people who've experienced some of the worst things that humanity has to offer. What knowledge could I share with them to make them feel better about this world we live in? What wisdom could I give them? And it took me a few minutes to realize that I was the one that needed to be taught a lesson, because these young people refused to allow the worst experiences of their lives to determine the direction that their life would take in a negative way. Not only that, but they were going to use their experience to try to make the world a better place. And I find that absolutely incredible. We can look at the headlines and think that this world is beyond saving. Or we can look to the incredible resolve of these young people and people like them around the world who have been through these experiences and refuse to be broken by them. These extremist groups, they know that when they attack innocent civilians, that the natural reaction will be anger, will be fear, that we will create structures in our society that separate us based on our race or our religion. This is what they want. They need this in order to fill their ranks. This is why it's so important that our reactions are not instinctual, that we realize in order to defeat these groups, we have to break down the structures that separate us. As I mature, I realize that the only way I can overcome the challenges of my past, which at times has been crippling, is to help others understand that hatred only produces more hate. But belief in nonviolence at least provides an opportunity to heal. Those cycles of violence, no matter how old, don't have to continue forever. I am not my father. And with that simple fact, I stand here as proof that violence isn't inherent in one's religion or race, and the son does not have to follow the ways of his father. And should we fulfill our obligation to live peacefully and to put in the work needed in order to obtain peace, however difficult it may sometimes be, that ultimately we'll leave this earth a better place for the ones we love. Thank you very much.